Hello all, welcome to my YouTube channel. Please do subscribe and click on bell icon to stay connected. In this tutorial we will understand complete Beego web application framework in 30 minutes. The tutorial is divided into 10 smaller sections, covering each and every aspect of Beego web framework. Here are various concepts we will try to understand with practical demo in next few minutes. In this tutorial, we shall understand everything related to Beego, a popular Go web application framework. In this first section of Beego tutorials, we shall understand Beego architecture, install Beego and related utilities, and create a demo application using Beego. Introduction. Beego is one of the most popular and commonly used web MVC frameworks. Beego might remind you of the Django web framework for Python. Beego is composed of 4 parts. Module 1, base module, including log module, config module, governor module. Module 2, task, is used for running time tasks or periodic tasks. Module 3, client, including OM module, HTTP/LIB module, cache module. Module 4, server, including web module. Beego will support gRPC in the future. Go language, Beego and B installation. One of the prerequisite for running Beego framework is having Go language installed. So based on your operating system, download the installer and have it installed following the link shown in this browser. After Go language is installed, we can set these 3 environment variables. First environment variable is GOROOT, is the root of the Go tree or installation. Second environment variable is GoPath, build and install packages outside the standard Go tree. Third environment variable is GOBIN, the location where the binaries, compiler, linker, etc. are installed. After Go language installation and setting environment variables, we can now check if everything is fine by running simple go version command. If the Go language installation is successful, it would show the current version of the Go language installed. Now we shall go ahead and install Beego framework. The first and the foremost thing we have to do to start a project is to set up its basic architecture. In Beego, this can be achieved easily using a tool called B. Install the B package using the Go command. As shown, once the B is installed, we can validate various options by running command B. Creating demo application. Now let's go ahead and create our first project using Beego. Open a terminal and point to your GoPath source directory, and create a project using the bnew command, as shown. Once the command has executed successfully, it will create a new Beego project. Go to the path of the newly created project, and enter brun to compile and run the project, as shown. Once command has executed successfully, B will build the project, and start the application. A web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. Browsing http://localhost port 8080/ will render the welcome page of the application. This concludes Beego overview, Beego installation, and creating our first Beego application. In this section of Beego framework tutorial, we shall create our first controller and our first root. Once we create our controller and root, then we go ahead and deploy it. One of the main components of a web application is the controller, which acts as a coordinator between the view and the model, and handles the user's requests, which could be a button click, or a menu selection, or HTTP GET and POST requests. Creating Beego controller. We can either use command line, or any IDE, to work on our sample project we created before. I personally prefer using IDE as that gives you many additional benefits and also avoid common problems. We are currently using Visual Studio IDE here. Let's import the sample project we created in our first section. 1. We have our sample project on IDE. Let's go ahead and create our first controller. Naming the first controller with same name as first controller, Go. I will share the Git project of complete demo we are doing as part of this tutorial in the description, so do not worry about the code. Creating root. Now let's go ahead and add root. Now let's go and deploy the application. It will deploy the controller and root we just created. We can now test the correctness of our controller and root. We can either use curl command, which is a command line utility to test REST call, or directly test using browser. This would return the sample data we provided under controller for the path employees. Let's understand the program we have written. Import Beego. Here, we imported Beego. Type first controller struct, Beego. Controller. Here, we defined the first controller struct type, which contains an anonymous struct field of type Beego controller, because of which first controller automatically acquires all the methods of Beego controller. Func this first controller, get employees. Here, we define the get employees handler, which will execute for every get request for the URL pattern employees. In Go, functions or handlers that start with a capital letter are exported functions, which means they are public and can be used outside the program. This concludes creating our first controller and router. In this section of Beego framework tutorial, we will learn how to create our first view to render the list of employees. A view is a visual representation of a model. It accesses data through the model and specifies how that data should be presented. It maintains consistency in its presentation when the model changes, which can be either through a push model, where the view registers itself with the model for change notifications, or a pull model, where the view is responsible for calling the model when it needs to retrieve the most current data. In the next few minutes, we will first create view, update our controller to add dashboard, update router to map to the dashboard, then run the Beego project to view results. Move to my first Beego project views, and create dashboard.tpl. As mentioned before, we shall have the entire project in the GitHub, and the respective link will be shared in video description. Move to first Beego project controllers, and edit first controller. Go to add the dashboard handler. Move to first Beego project routers and edit router. Go to add the get mapping dashboard, which will be handled by the dashboard handler, defined in first controller. Run the project using the command brun. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. Browsing http://localhost port 8080/dashboard will render the employee dashboard, as shown in the browser. This concludes creating our first view using Beego framework. In this section we will learn how to install Linux on Windows systems using WSL. Install Linux on Windows with WSL. Developers can access the power of both Windows and Linux at the same time on a Windows machine. The Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL, lets developers install a Linux distribution and use Linux applications, utilities, and bash command line tools directly on Windows, unmodified, without the overhead of a traditional virtual machine or dual boot setup. Prerequisites is to have the latest version of Windows installed. We can now install everything we need to run WSL with a single command. In the next few minutes we shall install the Ubuntu distribution of Linux on our Windows system. Open PowerShell or Windows command prompt in administrator mode by right-clicking and selecting Run as administrator. Enter the WSL install command, then restart your machine. By default it will install Ubuntu, or we can select the distribution using D option in WSL command. This command will enable the features necessary to run WSL and install the Ubuntu distribution of Linux. It would take few minutes to have the Ubuntu installed and ready to use. At the end, it would ask to enter your preferred username and password. Now we have Ubuntu installed on our Windows and can do all the operations generally we do on Ubuntu from here. In this section we shall have brief overview of Redis data store, and then install Redis on Windows. Let's get started. Redis is an open source, in-memory data store, used by millions of developers, as a database, cache, streaming engine, and message broker. Redis is voted the most loved database for 5 years running. Redis is at the center of an engaged community of developers, architects, and open source contributors. Redis core capabilities are in-memory data structures, programmability, extensibility, persistence, clustering, high availability. Now let's get started with install on Windows. Redis is not officially supported on Windows, however, we can install Redis on Windows for development. We had Ubuntu enabled on Windows using WSL2. For more details, refer to the link in description. We are following official documentation to install Redis on Windows, and then test it at the end. The document link will be provided in description. In this section we shall create our first session variable. Whenever we need to pass on the user data from one HTTP request to another, we can make use of HTTP sessions, which we will be covering in this section. This section assumes you have Redis installed and running locally on port 6379. A link is shared in the description with Redis overview and installation. Install the Redis package using the go get command. Move to go path my first Beego project controllers and create session controller. Go. Here we will define handlers, which make sure that only authenticated users can view the home page. A GitHub project will be shared with the source code of what we do now as part of description. Move to go path my first Beego project routers and edit router. Go. Add the get mapping, home, login, and logout, which will be handled by the home, login, and logout handlers, defined in first controller, respectively. Move to go path my first Beego project and edit main. Go to import Redis. Switch on the session usage in go path my first Beego project config, and add session variables. Run the program using brun. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. Firstly, we will access home by executing the curl command. This will give us an unauthorized access message as a response from the server. You are unauthorized to view the page. Apparently, we can't access it because we have to log in into the application first, which will create a Beego session ID. Now let's log into the application. This will result in the response from the server which contains Beego session ID. Now we will use the cookie Beego session ID created as part of the login request to access home. Now we can see the output of home page. Sometimes, we may want to perform logic either before an action method is called, or after an action method runs. In that case, we use filters, which we will be covering in this section. Filters are basically handlers, which encapsulate the common functionality. We just define them once, and then apply them to the different controllers and action methods. We do the following now. First, install context package. Second, create our first filter. Third, update the router, and run the application. Let us install the context package using go-get. Move to go path my first Beego project filters and create first filter, which runs before the controller, and log the IP address and current timestamp. Move to go path my first Beego project routers and edit router. Add the get mapping, which will be handled by the log manager filter. Now run the program using the following command. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. Next, we will execute a request to get all the employees by executing the following command. Once the command has executed successfully, we can see the IP and timestamp printed in the application logs on the console. Using Beego insert filter Beego before .router, filters.log manager, we inserted a filter in an application, which executes for the URL pattern /* before finding a router, and that is handled by log manager. Similar to Beego.before router, there are 4 other places where we can position the filters. Beego.before static, Beego.before exec, Beego.after exec, and Beego.finish router. This concludes this section explaining Beego filters. Error handling is one of the most important aspects in a web application design because it helps in 2 ways. Firstly, it lets the application user know in a relatively friendly manner that something has gone wrong, and they should contact the technical support department or someone from tech support should be notified. Secondly, it allows the programmer to put in some niceties to aid in the debugging of issues. In this section, we will learn how we can implement error handling in Beego. Move to go path my first Beego project, controllers, and create error controller, where we will define handlers to handle 404 and 500 HTTP errors, as well as the handler to handle any generic error in an application. Move to go path my first Beego project, controllers, and edit first controller, to add the getEmployee handler, which will get the ID from an HTTP request parameter, fetch the employee details from the static employee array, and return it as a response, or throw the generic error if the requested ID does not exist. Let's add new entry in root to call this controller getEmployerID. Move to go path my first Beego project, views, and create generic error with the following content. Run the program using the following command. We had a typo in the handler name in root. Let us correct the name and rerun again. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. Next, browsing http://localhost port 8080/employed?id equals 2 will give you the employee details, as seen, whereas browsing http://localhost port 8080/employed?id equals 5 as gives result as follows. It will give you the error message as some error occurred. This is because we have asked for details of the employee with the ID as 5, which does not exist in the static employee array, hence the generic error thrown from the server, which is handled by the error generic handler defined in error controller. This concludes handling HTTP errors in Beego. Caching data in a web application is sometimes necessary to avoid requesting the static data from a database or external service again and again. In this section of Beego framework tutorial, we will learn how we can implement caching in a Beego application. Beego supports 4 cache providers: File, Memcache, Memory, and Redis. In this section, we will be working with the framework default cache provider, which is a memory cache provider. First, install the Beego cache package using the go get command. Then move to go path my first Beego project, controllers, and create cache controller, where we will define the get from cache handler, which will get the value for a key from a cache, and write it to an HTTP response. Move to go path my first Beego project, routers, and edit router, to add the get mapping get from cache, which will be handled by the get from cache handler, defined in a cache controller. Now run the program using the following command: brun. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. Next, browsing http://localhost port 8080/get from cache will read a foo key value from the cache, append it to hello, and display it on the browser, as seen. On application startup, the key with the name foo, with the value as bar, will be added to the cache. This concludes our section on implementing caching in Beego. Once the Beego application is up and running, we can easily monitor application request statistics, performance, health checks, tasks, and the configuration status through its admin dashboard. We will learn how to do this in this section of Beego tutorial. Enable the application live monitor by adding enable admin equals true in go path my first Beego project configuration file application config. Optionally, change the port it listens on by adding fields in go path my first Beego project configuration file application config. We have mentioned admin port as 8088 here. Now run the program using the following command: brun. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080. and browsing http://localhost port 8088/ will render the admin dashboard, as seen here. Browsing http://localhost port 8088/QPS will show us the request statistics of an application, as we see here. Let's do some more testing to see if we can monitor all requests. This concludes the session on monitoring the Beego application. Once the application development is over, we have to deploy it, to make it available for use by the end users, which can be done either locally or remotely. In this section, we will learn how we can deploy our Beego application on a local machine. The application created by B is in the development mode, by default, and it's always a best practice to run an application in the production mode on the public-facing servers. We have to change the run mode as production in GoPath my first Beego project config app.config. Include static files, configuration files, and templates as part of the Beego application bytecode file in a separate directory by executing the following commands. Create my first Beego app deployment. Copy views, static, and Ko-Fi to my first Beego app deployment. Move to my first Beego app deployment, and use the nohub command to run an application as a backend process. Once the command has executed successfully, the web application will run on the default Beego port 8080, and browsing http://localhost port 8080/ will render the welcome page of the application, as seen. This concludes deploying the Beego application on a local machine. Engine overview. Engine is a high-performance web server, developed to facilitate the increasing needs of the modern web. It focuses on high performance, high concurrency, and low resource usage. In this tutorial we shall install Engine and check if it's working at the end. Engine comes with pre-compiled binaries for Windows which make it extremely easy to get started. If it did not come pre-compiled, we would need to have a compiler installed on our computer with a full environment. Fortunately, this is not the case. Let us download the latest stable version of Engine for Windows from official website. Once the downloading is done, extract it to your preferred directory. Please note some important locations or folders for Engine. Now let's start the Engine from command line. Verify Engine Windows installation. We should be able to go to http://localhost, and we should see the Welcome to Engine default page. In the previous section, we learned how we can run the Beego application locally. In this section, we will be deploying the same application with Engine. This section assumes you have Engine installed and running on port 80. For detailed video on deploying Beego application locally or installation of Engine, refer to links in description. Open the Engine configuration file at engineconfig engine.config and replace the location block under server with the following content shown. Start Engine. Run the Beego application by executing brun. Once the command has executed successfully, browsing http://localhost port 80/ will render the welcome page of the application, as seen. This concludes deploying the Beego application with Engine. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Do not forget to click on the bell icon.